You're listening to the Friday Sports Show with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, on Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, bringing you all the sport from around the area and an insight into sport around the globe. And tonight we've got a fascinating guest, one of the best, if not the best, in the business at what he does, who's going to give us a really, really interesting insight into the world of working as a coach around the world. He's worked pretty much in every corner of the globe, and he's going to share some stories and give us a really, really fascinating insight into his profession. So stay tuned for that. Before we interview our guest, we're going to take you to a tune. So kick back and enjoy the show. You're listening to 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show, with your host, Jim Petruzzi. And tonight, as I've mentioned, we have a really fascinating guest. He's pretty much the best in the business at what he does. I think we're very privileged to have a guest of this magnitude who's going to share some experiences that he had in the world of football and beyond football too. So we're going to sort of look into what it's like working in the game as a professional around the world. And there's probably no one as experienced as our guest this evening to share an insight into what it's like to work as a coach pretty much in four corners of the globe, and highly respected coach in the world of football, one of the most respected coaches, and we sort of see a lot of coaches on TV at press conferences and so on and so forth, but sometimes we forget, if you want to call it the back room or in the periphery, there are important people at every club and every team that sort of keep the wheels in motion. So our guest this evening is Roger Spry. Thanks for coming on board the show, Roger. Great to have you on board.
It's a pleasure, Jim. It's great to be on board. It's good to speak to you after such a long time.
Absolutely, and doesn't time fly? I mean, obviously we're both relatively busy people, but it's always great to catch up. And Roger, also start from the beginning. I mean, this day and age, we sort of hear a lot about fitness and how it's important, and obviously you're more than a conditioning and fitness expert. You have a lot of strings to your bow, but we sort of see a lot in the game analysis. We see it a lot on television. People talk about fitness, the importance of it. We hear about player burnout, but I don't think there's anyone in a better place than yourself to talk about these things, because when you think of pioneers in the game, I go to conferences, Roger, in sports conferences, and people talk, and obviously you've had a lot of changes in the way things are done, but yourself, you're a pioneer in all this. So can you tell us a bit about how it began for you? How did you get into working in football with some of the methods you've got that are unique and innovative?
Well, basically I was a footballer myself. I was a young player at Wolves when Wolverhampton Wanderers were one of the best teams in Europe at that time, and I was a young player there, and I had a very bad injury, and because of that I was off football about 11 months, and when I came back the manager told me that I was frightened to tackle and I was frightened to do this and frightened to do that, which at the time I disagreed with, but in retrospect he was absolutely right. And then I came back and started playing for semi-professional clubs round where I lived, and then I had the same injury again. But the first time I had it, I had an English surgeon look after me, and it was very long-winded and slow, all about rest and recuperation, and it took me 6 to 7 months to get anywhere near fit again. But the second time I did it, it was a Brazilian surgeon who did it, and he was the opposite. I mean, the day after I had my operation, he had me up and he'd taken me down to the physiotherapist, and I was horrified and terrified, because I thought, oh my God, this is ridiculous, until I started working, and his philosophy was, well, you broke your leg, but the rest of your body still functions, so if we can get the rest of your body to work and work well, it'll stimulate your injury, which I thought, well, surely that's common sense. Why doesn't everyone do that?
Yeah.
And that was basically, and I got really interested in this guy because his brother-in-law was a director at Fluminense in Brazil. And we were just talking one day, and I'd always been fascinated with, obviously like most of us are in football, fascinated by Brazilians or South American footballers or Latin footballers, because they move and play in a completely different way than I was used to. And we were just talking one day, and he said, well, if you ever want to go to Brazil, he said, and I will arrange it for you, and you can go and see what they do over there. So I said, right, can you arrange it next week? Joking, and he said, yeah, okay. So that was it. I went across, and what absolutely amazed me, Jimmy, was as soon as I walked in and watched them train, I instantly recognised what they were doing, because I'd studied martial arts since I was 10 years old, and I was a black belt in karate when I was 15, and I'm an 8th degree black belt in martial art in school Mugendo now. So as soon as I saw these guys moving and working, I said to the coaches, what martial art is this? And they looked at me as though I was something from Mars, and they said, who said that it was a martial art? I said, well, I'm telling you it's a martial art because I can recognise all the movements. And they started laughing, and the one guy come and put his arm around me, and he said, it's called capoeira. And I said, I'd never heard of it, and they showed me some of the movements. Then I realised very, very quickly the reason why the Brazilians and the South Americans and Portuguese are completely different condition-wise. Now, the biggest difference was that they trained their players more like dancers or more like shadow boxers, as opposed to in Europe where we train like athletes. So none of their training was based on, you know, the traditional parameters that we use in Northern Europe. You know, nothing to do with speed, nothing to do with how much you bench press, nothing to do with, you know, all of the parameters that are the normals, and all of their stuff was based on unpredictability, flexibility, mobility, disguise. And I was just fascinated by it, and I just fell in love with it, and I started studying them. And then I came back to Europe, and then, you know, tried to show different people what I'd learnt over there. And most people laughed at me and thought I was insane. But there was the odd coach who was very different in England, and I was offered to go down to West Ham with John Law, because John Law was into innovation and different things. When I started training him, they used to stand there with their mouths on and they said, "We can't believe this stuff, it's just from another world." And then he phoned a friend of his, Malcolm Allison, and Malcolm Allison, who was then in Portugal at Sporting Lisbon, had just won the double. He invited me, and I went and met him, and he fell in love with it, and that's how it basically started. At the highest level, you know, I was offered to work with those people, and because Malcolm had always said all through his career when he was at Manchester City, he was always searching for something that he couldn't find, because he was really into fitness. But he said that he had lots of athletics coaches from, you know, the sprint coaches come in and all this stuff, and he said he looked and he thought it was okay, but it wasn't what he was looking for. He saw me work for about 2 minutes and he went, "Oh my God," he said, that's it. He said, "Where did you learn all this stuff?" And that's how it started, you know. And the other thing as well, which was tying this all together, like yourself, I'm a musician, and when I saw how important rhythm and intensity and everything was tied into music in South America, it just all came very natural to me. It all fitted together. And, you know, that's the way it started. And, you know, after that, then I worked in Portugal for 10 years at, you know, biggest clubs in Portugal, F.C.Porto, Sporting Lisbon, and working with people working with me when they were very young, starting off. People like Mourinho used to work with us at a team called Vitoria Setubal with me and Malcolm, and watch the training, and his dad was there as a goalkeeping coach and everything. So all of those things came together very, very quickly, and it just started snowballing worldwide.
No, it's fascinating stuff. And speaking of Mourinho, Roger, sort of correct me if I'm wrong here, but I once read Mourinho's book, and I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that he mentioned you as well in the book as well. Is that sort of correct there?
Yes.
Sort of just come to mind there. Really, I mean, just to sort of for the listeners to see the magnitude of sort of, you know, of what you've done in the game, and to have an accolade of the likes of Mourinho. To obviously for me, irrespective of, you know, last season at United, for me, and looking back on it now, it was probably a much bigger achievement that people give him credit for under the circumstances. The most successful manager in the modern game, to have someone like that mention you in a book is no mean feat. But on the other side of things too, you know, a lot of people talk about Wenger, how when he came in, he revolutioned the game in England in the way he brought these sort of methods. But I sort of think it was, you know, people like yourself who, even prior to that, were making inroads in terms of how to go about, you know, peaking at the right time and so on and so forth. And you mentioned there that, you know, when you first sort of introduced some of these methods, some people took to it, some people didn't. How have you seen the game transition, Roger, in the UK? I mean, there's probably no one better placed than you with your background and experience to sort of talk about how, if we go back to, you know, 20, 30 years ago, you know, steak and chips before a game and a pint afterwards to where we are now. How have you seen the game transition over the years?
Well, it's been a dramatic change, and it's been a change which is very, very simple to explain. Since the advent of foreign coaches coming over here, you know, people like Guardiola and Mourinho and all these guys have come, and Wenger. I mean, I worked with Arsene at Monaco for a while, and you know, a lot of the stuff that Arsene did, believe me, it wasn't revolutionary. It was just stuff that people in South America had done for the last. For example, a lot of the stuff they did was the Brazilians had done since the early 1950s. So it was just revolutionary in this country because people hadn't seen it, you know.
Yeah.
But since the advent of the foreign coaches coming over and bringing foreign players, if you remember maybe 20 years ago, if somebody signed a foreign player, that they would struggle to adjust to English football simply because they're trained one way in their country, and they come to England and the training is completely different. And you know, I'm not saying it was better or worse. That's up for debate. But the way they were trained in South America was all about elasticity and flexibility and mobility. And they come here, then they're asked to run for fun in training and throwing up and all this business and yo-yo testing and bleep testing and all the things which in South America they don't use. And you know, their methods are based on the ability to create space out of nothing, where they come to England and they're taught, you know, like English players, where to create space you look at the space behind the person that you're attacking and then attack that space. Now people like Messi and Cristiano, and you know, I was lucky enough to work with Ronaldo many years ago, not Cristiano, the Ronaldo, and you know, I was instrumental in the development of Figo at Sporting Lisbon, and people like Deco and all these guys I worked with. They were never ever athletic in the sense that they never used to look to space behind people to beat them. They would look where they could create the maximum amount of chaos, regardless of how many people were in front of them. So if there was one person in front of them, two people in front of them, four people in front of them, they'd just take them on. And that was, they weren't looking for space. They were creating space themselves by like I said, like the shadow boxing type of philosophy, where they'd drop a shoulder or they'd feint one way and go the opposite way, and all these, it's all based on individual ability to beat people. And that's the one thing in South America and in Portugal and Spain. The very first lesson that a young player has, irrelevant of what position he plays, he must be able to beat someone with a ball.
Yeah.
And that is crucial, you know.
That's a fascinating point you made there. And the reason being is that, you know, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and we sort of got talking, as you do, and one of the points that were raised was, if Messi was coming through the system in the UK, would he have been picked up? And you know, obviously the obvious, you know, he's a very talented player. You know, it's easily seen. You know, obviously he's the first player in the team sheet, but you've got to wonder if there's some coaches in the way some of the centres and the academies in the UK recruit players, or at least used to do. Now it's changing a bit as well. Would they have seen that? Because the emphasis isn't always on beating a player. It's a travesty.
It's based on athletic prowess. So, you know, how strong is he, how good is he in the air, how fast is he over 40, and all these type of things. Whereas, you know, the Messis of this world, they are taught or encouraged, because a lot of it is the way they describe it. You'll explain, understand this totally from a musician's point of view, Jim. What they call it in South America, they call it jazz football.
Yeah.
So, and you know, jazz, it's all about improvisation.
Yeah.
Now, what it isn't, what a lot of people get confused, it's not just you can play anything that you want and it's, you know, whatever you like, but what it is, you're all playing in the same time signature, you're all playing in the same key, you're playing the song, but every time you play it, it's different, because at any given time, someone within the group will step forward, not literally but figuratively, like first it'll be the lead guitarist, and then it'll be the sax player, then it's the keyboard player, and that's exactly what capoeira is based on. It's a big circle and there's two people in the middle, and at any given time you go in and tap somebody on the shoulder, then you join in. And so it's all about individual and collective improvisation. Now that's, I mean, a very dear friend of mine who I've done lots of work with over the years, Mario Zagallo, the Brazilian legend. Yeah. And that's what he says, you can't explain that to a person who doesn't understand music. He said, because music and football are the same thing. He said, don't you understand? And I totally understand, like you do, because you're a musician. Yeah. And it's great when you understand that it's about improvisation, but to improvise, you've got to know all of the things first, and then decide what to use and what not to use. Now, none of that is based on strength. None of it is based on speed. None of it is based on, one max type of, development. It's all based on creativity. Now, that's the thing that I think a lot of the people either don't look for because they can't control it, and I think that's a big question, or they don't recognise it at first. Because, like you rightly said, that it's not just about the individual movement of Messi, it's about the players who play around him. You watch what Suarez does, or when Neymar plays, and what they do to create space for Messi to go in by their movements. So it's not just individual creativity, it's collective creativity. Now, when you see the movements in Iniesta and Xavi and Messi and all these people made together, and then you watch how the way we describe it, I'm writing a book at the moment, and it's called swarm mentality. And it's like, when you get, when you see thousands of starlings in the sky of a night, and they're all moving in these wonderful undulating patterns, and you say, okay, who's the leader in that? And the answer is all of them and none of them. And it's all about frequencies, and frequency, that's what music is, it's different frequencies.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what these guys do. And when you watch these people play, or I've been lucky enough to train some of them, it almost looks to the outsider telepathic, because you do something and I instantly or instinctively, because I've worked with you for such a long time, I do something in conjunction with you. It's like in jazz. If I change the tempo, then the rest of the group changes the tempo. If I change the key, then the rest of the group instinctively change the key with me. And that's what these great players do. And this is the big question, a lot of English players can do that when they're young, but they're discouraged from doing it simply because it's difficult to control. You've got to give more permission to the player to play, where a lot of coaches, not just in England but all over the world, are very reticent to relinquish control.
Absolutely. It's really interesting you say that as well. It's interesting perspective. I mean, I remember way back in, I can sort of go all the way back in around about, say, 96, 97, Roger, and I was doing some work. I was working closely with a guy you probably know, David Richardson, who was a fitness coach at the time of Crystal Palace Football Club, and I started, great guy, and I started working with him, and I was sort of based myself out of his personal training centre, and I was doing a lot of consultancy work with a lot of different clubs and players. I had a stable of players that I was working with, and I sort of sit down with Dave as well and help him do planning for the club that he was working with, and I every time I sort of look around to see who was doing what, as we all do in this industry, your name kept coming up, and I thought, well, this guy is doing things differently, to what a lot of people are doing, and eventually, as you do, I sort of enrolled on a course, and my academic career began, and I was at Loughborough University studying sports performance conditioning, and I felt for me, what I was learning was useful, and I've sort of carried on being an academic. But what it didn't do, Roger, is give me the practicality to go out there and implement something that was going to give me that sort of extra mile with the players I was working with. And I felt that what you were doing was practical. It made sense. The musical concept as well that you mentioned there is a big one, because from a psychological perspective, cutting a long story short, we see how that can affect people's mood and mindset and so on and so forth. And I felt that for me at that point I started sort of getting fascinated into the mind-body link, and I felt what you were doing had this sort of mind-body connection.
That's the big thing, Jim. The one thing that I learned, I've worked for the last 10 years, up until the beginning of this year, I worked with the Austrian national team. And we went from 102nd in the world rated to 10th. And I'm not saying all that was down to me, but a lot of it was down to the change that we made with the coaching education. So we educated all the up-and-coming young coaches in the methods of introducing music and rhythm and all of these things, which because the Austrians were very Germanic, old-fashioned Germanic. And when I introduced this stuff, and I said, well, there's one country in Europe. You said all music in South America, or 95% of South American music, is written in 3/4 time. Now, if you're working 3/4 time, that means you haven't got a dominant side. If you're working 4/4 time, so it's left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, that means you're working on a dominant side, and that produces an unbalance in the player's physique. If you're working in 3/4 time, it's 1, 2, 3, change, 1, 2. So you're going from left to right in a flowing movements. And we did some studies about this. I've also worked for UEFA for the last 40 years as a coach educator. We did some studies on the importance of different tempos and different rhythms. Now, the one thing that was fascinating, most of the players who were very bilaterally developed had come from countries where the music, their prime music, was written in 3/4 time. Now, the one country in Europe that I thought when I first went there, this would instantly be a hit with, was Austria, because their national dance or their national music is the waltz. Now, the waltz is written in 3/4 time, and once I started explaining to it, these guys instantly clicked into him. Players like Marko Nautovic and David Alaba and all these guys, all of a sudden, they're dancing. We call it the dance within the game. They're dancing with and without the ball, and you try and explain that to a traditionalist when you sort of, well, how fast do they run and how far do they run in the game, and you know, all this statistics-based stuff. Like, if you look, I mean, I've just been at a conference at St George's the last few days. There's a big FIFA conference, and I was invited on the night to speak to some other people, and there were 46 technical directors from different countries there, and I knew 37 of them.
Wow!
It was ridiculous. You know, my friend who I was with, who was the technical director of the Israeli Federation, my other friends at technical director of the Portuguese Federation, and all these guys, and we're all talking about what we're talking about now. And you look and you think, well, I couldn't have had this conversation 20 years ago because they'd thought I was insane. The Portuguese guys, you know.
Absolutely. That's the interesting thing. I mean, the thing is too, it's like, you know, what you mentioned there is really interesting. And from a listener's point of view, one thing to think about is that some of the concepts that you brought into the game, you know, all those years ago, now, don't get me wrong, obviously, you know, the game's evolved and sports science is huge and everyone has their own style of doing things and it's a big thing. But at the point of when you sort of brought these sort of methods in, it just was, you know, the way I'll compare it to is a bit like, say, I mean, you know, I sort of do a lot of work in therapy as well. That's sort of my area too, and things like mindfulness and meditation now are a given in one sense. But if you went back, you know, 10, 15 years ago and you said you do mindfulness, everyone will sort of think, well, you know, meditation, what in the world's all that about? But
I've been a Buddhist for 46 years.
Yeah, and see, and all of the concepts of mindfulness exactly derive from precisely.
You know, it ties in, and you know, the number of people have said to me, you know, when they don't know me, you're a European kickboxing champion, you're an 8th-degree black belt of karate, you're a professional musician, and you're a top professional coach. How do you do all that together? And it's very simple. I say to them, it's all the same. It's the same thing.
It is.
And they go, what do you mean? I say, it's the same thing. The philosophies are the same. For music, they have this concept in Brazil, which I introduced to the Austrian team, and it's called one heart, one mind. And what that means is that every player in the team works to the same rhythm. Every player has the same mentality, and so before the game, we do this warm-up where we're all moving in rhythmic movements, but clapping to the beat. Now, the beat changes dependent on the mood of the team, and the captain sets the beat. So if the captain's a little bit euphoric or is a little bit down, then the tempo of the clapping changes. But you've got 20 players all on the pitch doing these movements, all in perfect synchronicity. I remember in the European Championships in 2016, I spoke just before the game. I said to Marko, Marko Nautovic, I said, remember, one heart, one mind. And he said, he said, you've missed out one thing. I said, what's that? He said, one sound. And we had 20 people clapping in perfect synchronicity. Now, that is the mind-body link.
Absolutely. You know? And you know, we've seen, you know, mindfulness develop, you know, from derivative being, you know, Zen meditation, with Zen Buddhism, the likes of, you know, Kabat-Zinn, who developed secular mindfulness, which has got a lot of research base, and you sort of see how it derives from Buddhism, and you know. And it's really amazing because obviously I think that for me it's about sort of taking what's right for you in all these things, and I certainly, you know, have the philosophy that, you know, football it is almost like a mirror of life, and it's not easy. You go through tough times. It can be a lonely world, out there as well, if you're a coach, because obviously, you're out there. I mean, it's not easy. You win matches, everyone sort of, you can be the flavour of the month, but things don't go well, and it can be pretty tough out there. And I think it's really important to incorporate some sort of philosophy. And I suppose, what sort of fascinates me, sort of, your journey across the world, and like yourself, I mean, I've had the privilege to work in a lot of different countries. I mean, you strike me as sort of person, Roger, who embraces the culture of the country you're in, and that's one of the things I do too. I sort of make an effort to really get to know the place I'm in.
Yes.
And embrace it. And do you find that's really important as a coach for anyone?
It's crucial. The one thing, the first thing I do when I'm offered a job is, if I've got time, I start learning the language before I go there.
Mm-hmm.
I can speak 6 languages and understand probably another 3. And so it's not just the language that you're learning about the humour, you're learning about what things make people sad, and all these different things. So to immerse yourself in the culture, first you've got to know what makes people laugh and cry. And if you can't do that, I know a lot of coaches who've worked in different countries and they don't know one word of the language, and you think, well, do you think you're going to have any empathy with the players? And they say, what do you mean? And that's one thing I've always learned. Malcolm Allison said something to me many years ago. He said, Roger, he says, don't judge yourself by how many trophies you win. He says, because in your career you'll win a lot of trophies and you'll also get relegated. He said, that's just part of the game. He said, but I guarantee the biggest thing is the day you walk in the club and the day you walk out, how you've affected people. And he says, I know you're going to be successful. He says, I see the effect you have on people. He says, as soon as you work with them, they're all laughing. I have people like Figo and everything. Sadly, Jimmy, my wife passed away a few years ago, and Figo and all these guys, honestly, they were so supportive. It was just unbelievable. Now, I hadn't seen him for about 7 or 8 years, and Mourinho the same, and all those people. And when you make that connection on a spiritual, emotional, and physical level, which you and I try and do, you're more than a coach. You become, a number of people who I get letters from now. I had an email this morning from one of my friends. He plays in Italy in Serie A, he plays for Fiorentina, and he calls me his mentor as a football coach, but also he says, you're my teacher in life. I said, thank you, George. And that's exactly the effect. And I have the same thing with the players. You become like brothers, fathers, and you're very emotional. And if you're connected on that level, then they'll do anything for you. And Absolutely. This is what I would say to people when I go to a different club or a different team. The one thing I cannot guarantee is success, because no one can do that. That's impossible. I could have the richest club in the world and you could buy all the best players and they might not have the chemistry to fit together, etc. But the one thing I will promise you, every person in this club, and I'm talking about the staff, the ground staff, the kitchen people, the physio, they will be better than the day I came, simply because we'll have grown together.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting insight, and I think that's the other area as well too. I think one thing that's is really important is on the other side of things, what someone like yourself, Roger, who puts so much into the game and so much planning and so much effort, and obviously it's really important to you and you build these strong connections. But do you ever feel like many people go for adversity, we all sort of go for adversity in one sense, and how do you sort of keep yourself motivated? I mean, obviously, from a coaching point of view, you're out there and you've got a remit, you're a professional, and there's no better professional than yourself. But in terms of your own motivation, keeping the motivational levels up, and when you experience adversity as well, how do you find that you keep yourself on that sort of path of motivation, getting up in the morning and sometimes having to put
it's that... It's a great question, Jimmy, and the answer is very, very simple. It's exactly what we've just talked about. It's the byproduct of being emotionally connected with the players of the team. As soon as... Now, I'm 68 years old. Yeah. But I can still do things that some of the 25-year-olds can't do physically. I mean, I can do the full split, I can kick above my head, lightning quick and all these different things. So all of the things that I ask the players to do, I don't tell them, tell them to do it. I show them how to do it. So I've always been a hands-on coach in the sense that don't tell me, show me. Because someone said to me many years ago, Roger, you're a clever guy, you speak a lot of languages, but you'll go to one country where you ain't got a word in that language, so how are you going to communicate? And so I stopped communicating less verbally and more physically. And that is, so when I go out into training session every morning, I'm part of the training session, so right, we're going to do this, and I do it. Now, if you're working with, the elite player, that motivates you because they're obviously progressing and getting better. And I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, I've got to work hard to stay ahead of those guys in this, or I've got to work hard to keep up with them. So it's that daily motivation of being pulled along by youth. And the Brazilians have got a wonderful saying, and I've told every coach I've ever worked with this, and Andy Roxburgh is the technical director of UEFA. He uses it at every conference he's ever used. And the Brazilians say, you're never too old to have a happy childhood.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And to me, that is the most, and I'm the same. And Zagallo used to say to me, Roger, how old do you think you are? What do you mean? He says, I didn't ask you how old you are, how old do you think you are? I said, 18, 19, and he said, and me, and Zagallo was like 76, but he's still there, because he was famous in Brazil for, there was two schools of thought. He was classed in Rio, that part, of being the inventor of the banana kick, and then in Santos there was another player called Pepe, who was supposed to have invented the banana kick. But you talk about players bending. You want to see the thing you can do with the ball. It's just frightening. Yeah. And I think that is the key to keeping you young. It's the, I'm like you, I'm a musician, but I'm not stuck in the 1960s or the 70s, because a lot of my friends are musicians. They'll say, "Oh, this modern music is crap," and I say, "Have you ever listened to it?" I say, "No." Now my daughter comes here with her friends, and I put some music on. And all the friends go, "Oh, what's that? I've never. Oh, that's brilliant. What is it?" Oh, it's this group from Iran called Hiatus. Oh, incredible! Wow, what? Can you buy it? I said, "Of course you can." Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that that applies also to methods too. It's it's always sort of keep developing, keep evolving, and some people, what they'll do, from my experience, and each to their own. Everyone does what's right for them, but they'll learn something years ago, and that'll be the framework that they sort of work with. And I think that you've got to keep adapting, and I think as well too, and people say to me sometimes when I speak at conferences too, and so on and so forth, you're one of the only people who criticises their own methods. And I said, well, I've got to do, because there's nothing 100%. There's no panacea. It's like, I'm more than happy to sort of convey the information, not try and convince anyone. This is what I know, and I have a strong science base, and I do quite a lot from the literature as well, because it's important to me in that respect. And I'm always, of that sort of thought process where what I say now might change in 5 years, and what I said 10 years ago could change, and I hold my hands up. There are things that I sort of used to look at 20 years ago, and I look back thinking now, well,
that's growth, isn't it? That's growth as a human being. I'll give you an example. About 6 months ago, there was a big article about me in Portuguese newspapers, because it was some anniversary of one of the clubs I'd worked at. And they put this great big thing on the headlines, Roger Spry was instrumental to bring all those methods, etc., etc. And they had so much feedback from guys who were working at clubs saying Roger Spry was an absolute genius 20 years ago. And then Mourinho and Fernando Santos, who's the national coach who I worked with at Porto, they wrote to the newspapers in quite an aggressive way, saying 20 years ago Mourinho was Roger's assistant, working at 30 years ago, sorry. I was working at a very small second division club in Lisbon. They said, do you think that we've evolved as coaches? And everyone said, of course you have. He said, well, do you think Roger Spry does the same stuff now that he did 30 years ago? I can assure you he doesn't.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating insight. And speaking of Mourinho, I think that obviously he's working in the media now. He's no doubt going to be back in football as a manager soon. I don't know him personally. I spoke to a lot of people who have worked with him. There's various opinions. I think we very respected, obviously, what he's achieved and so on and so forth. I feel personally last season some of the media that I don't think at Man United it's sort of it ended well. I think that, I think personally, I still stand by. I think he did an incredible job based on the circumstances, and this is just my opinion. I think he was almost made a scapegoat. But there's probably no one better than yourself in terms of what's his methods like, Roger Mourinho. What do you sort of make of based on your experience, obviously over the years, and I know that you've sort of seen him evolve as well. What do you make of Mourinho? What does he do different in terms of how he sets teams out, and what is it about him that sort of brought him so much success?
I think the biggest thing, which a lot of people don't really understand, is his attention to detail. For example, you've got to be very careful when you're talking to someone in a foreign language, because even though Jose speaks English and very good English, he's not 100% perfect in English. So sometimes he'll say something which is a word which really doesn't literally translate from Portuguese to English, and then I say to him sometimes, Jose, I know what you've just said, but people won't know what you mean. And he said, you understand there's a difference between what you're saying and what you mean. Now, for example, that a lot of the things, when people talk to Mourinho or they meet him for the first time, they're enthralled about his tactics and this, that and the other. Now, you've got to understand what he means by tactics isn't what they mean by tactics. Tactics for him is more on an individual or a little bit of a collective sense, in the sense that he'll give you, say you're playing against me on Sunday, he'll give you a dossier on all my weaknesses individually. So I know that, for example, if I get the ball, 65-70% of the time I'll take the ball the outside of my right foot, looking down the line to play the ball and then get the ball back and do whatever. So what Mourinho will do, he'll say, right, every time the goalkeeper gets the ball and rolls it out to Roger, I want you to close him down on his right side. What we're not saying is that Roger can't kick with his left foot, but what we're saying is he's not as efficient on that side as he is on the right side. And so what he does, he works on reducing the opponent that I'm playing against, their efficiency. And then that affects, so in other words, if I'm used to playing the ball out to my right foot and doing etc., the guy to the left of me knows what I'm going to do. Now all of a sudden I've been made or pressurised to play on my left foot, then all of a sudden it affects the guy to my left. So it's not just affecting the individual, it's affecting the biomechanical efficiency of the team structure. Now that's what he's brilliant at. And Fernando Santos is the same. Fernando Santos, who's probably, in my opinion, the best coach I've worked with for a long period of time. I worked with him in Porto for 3 years, and then another 3 years in Greece at Panathinaikos and AEK Athens. So, but he's the same. It's all about structures of teams can be broken. It doesn't matter how disciplined the team is. If and this, they call them breakers, and a breaker is someone like Messi. It doesn't matter how good your organised system is, he'll just break it because he'll go past two players, which pulls another two players out of position, which pulls another two players behind them out of position. So all of a sudden, one person can break their system, and that's more of his type of idea of tactics, as opposed to 4-4-2, 4-3-3, 4-4, whatever, because that is a system. It's not the tactic. The tactic is the philosophy of what you're going to do, and what he does. And a lot of the Portuguese coaches, Nuno Santos at Wolves does the same thing. What he does, he looks for the weaknesses, because you've got to be careful when you say that, because every player in the world has got weaknesses, and every team has a weakness, and every player has a weakness. Even Messi or Cristiano, there's always some parts of their game which isn't as good as the rest of it. So what we're saying, we're not saying he's not very good. It's like Messi. The best example I can give you is when Messi scored against Bayern Munich and chopped Boateng down like a tree. Do you remember?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, my friend played in that game, David Alaba, and the coaches at the end of the game, they were really, really concerned about the pressure he was getting from the media, because he was ridiculed on Twitter and everything because Messi's made him look stupid. But what they've been told, everything that he did was correct, because they've told him, and he doesn't need to be told because he's seen Messi enough times, if Messi is going away from goal, don't let him cut back onto his left foot, because then you're literally giving him an open goal. So what Boateng has done is tried to push him wide on his right foot, and then Messi's gone to go one way, and then Boateng thought he's cutting inside, but he's not. He carries straight on in a straight line onto his right foot, and Boateng gets his feet tangled up and chops down. And then the other thing, which people don't ever discuss, the best so-called goalkeeper in the world at that time was Neuer. Neuer has read the situation, thinking, well, now from that position he's in, he can't score, so he's got to cut back on his left side. So Neuer has taken 2 steps off his near post to cover the cross, because he said he can't score from there. But what Messi's done is hit the ball the outside of his right foot to the near post. He's beat the best goalkeeper in the world at the near post with the outside of his wrong foot.
Incredible. I mean,
it is incredible, but this is what I'm saying, that these guys can break systems, and
absolutely.
That's what Mourinho wants players to do. He doesn't. I don't care if you know whoever he's playing against, there is a weakness, and he'll find it, or he'll try and find it.
Absolutely, no, and that's the thing. I think for me, when he sort of mentioned that in the press conference, Mourinho had mentioned that second was one of his best achievements at United. A lot of people thought it was tongue in cheek, but I generally thought when he said that he's probably spot on, because obviously you look at the transition, you looked at the squad, you looked at all things said and done, and equally you got the likes of City, who's got a lot of money, a great squad. You got the likes of Chelsea. These teams weren't around 15 years ago in respect to competing. It was always that sort of 2-horse race, Arsenal versus United, but you never really had 4 or 5 teams, and also the money throughout the league, the distribution of the money as well. You got teams at the bottom of the league that can put out a decent team on their day, can get a result. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's changed, I think, in the Premier League, and I think the thing is too, Roger, what's sort of caught up in the game, every team pretty much has got a sports scientist, psychologist, got all this backroom staff, analyst, and I think in one sense it's great, and it sort of evens things up. On the other side of the fence too, I think, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and I don't want to sort of pull any punches. That it is what it is, and everyone to their own. But I don't know if you remember, there was a film called Moneyball based on it's a great film, but there's a team in the UK that sort of tried to model. And I said to him, I do respect the fact that you look at the stats and so on and so forth, but I said, is there a point where you can't put the value on a player where, for example, okay, the stats don't lie, but the point being, what value do you get from, say, having a Roger Spry in the dressing room, having someone who can, from a playing point of view, some big players over the last however many years as well, who statistically, for example, they may not be at what you're looking for, but it lifts the whole team. Do you think there's a danger, the stats that if you go down that road, do you need?
It's one of my key gripes about modern football is that you're an academic. I've got a master's degree, and so I've been through all academia and everything. And the problem with statistics is if you get 10 academics in the room and they'll analyse those statistics, and you'll get 10 different.
Absolutely, great point.
And the other thing is as well with statistics, they're very, very misleading. But, the one I always use, and I used it the other day in St George's, and these coaches stood up and started clapping me when I said it, because they totally agree. The player in the Spanish league who every game of his career is last in how many metres he runs in a game. He's last at the bottom of the table in statistics of how many sprints that he does at maximum speed, in a game over the season. But what they don't say is that this guy has scored 50 goals plus in the last 4 years. He's also had 46 assists on average over those 5 years, and he happens to be the best player, in my opinion, in history. Is Lionel Messi. So
Absolutely.
If you look at the statistics are. And I've had this when I was at Panathinaikos, so I worked with an Italian coach who was 100% statistic based. Yeah. And it was all about, this guy's got to do this. And you'd have these Italian sports scientists, measuring guys. And they would come to me and they say, this player here, he needs to do more aerobic conditioning because, look at him when he's doing the beat test. Now, what they didn't realise, for the previous year before they came, me and the doctor had been working with this guy because he was chronically overtrained. Before we came train in the morning, he'd go to the swimming pool and swim 100 lengths. He'd train with us. On the way home, he'd swim another 20 lengths. and then he'd train with us on the afternoon, and then on the night he'd go out for a run. Now this guy is without any doubt, he's the fittest player I've ever worked with by a million mile. But it was always burning out because he was doing too much.
Absolutely.
Now, if we'd have taken into consideration the statistics that these guys were giving us, this guy needs to do more aerobic conditioning because look, and the doctors looked at Alberto and he got very angry. He says, these guys are looking at pieces of paper. They don't know the guy's personality. They don't know his background.
Absolutely.
They don't know the inner structure of what goes on in his life. So if we'd have given, it was a guy called Luka Vidra, he was Greek international. If we'd have given him the prognosis that these guys had given us, then we'd have run him into the ground and we'd have killed him, literally, possibly killed him because he'd also got problems with his heart.
Wow.
Simply because of overtraining. Now this is where statistics, I mean, have you ever come across a book, Jimmy, called The Black Swan?
It rings a bell.
It's all about statistical analysis.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It's. I mean, I love it. I've got most of that guy's books, but that's it. It puts into a nutshell about if you study statistics, like we said earlier, you can come to lots of different conclusions, and you can adjust the conclusions in your
absolutely
to prove your theories work.
Precisely.
Now, the thing is in football, where you've got so many variables, I always say to people, when they, especially in sports science, because I do lots of lectures at universities, and these guys are green and they've just finished their final year, and that they're full of enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And you're talking to them and you say, look, what's the use of having all these statistics without knowing the person? Because I'll give them an example. Okay, show me some statistics. And we go through them and I say, well, I know that player because I've worked with him, and the reason he doesn't do this is because of that, and the reason he doesn't, and they won't take into consideration, and it's one word, I act as the devil's advocate, I do it all the time. I say there's one word which completely destroys everything that you stand for, and they say, what's that? I say it's random. And football is a game of random intervals of work, random intensities, random planes of movement, all of these things. And if you can, the whole point of research is to, when you're doing some research as a scientist, you must have one thing, that's repeatability. So in other words, when I do these tests, conditions must be exactly the same every time you do it. And they all agree with that totally, because under laboratory conditions, that's what they look at. I say, okay, how can you do that with football?
Absolutely. That's a great point.
You've got all of these different variables, and then you've got an infinite number of possibilities within those variables, because you've got 11 players playing against another 11 players. Then you've got the things which none of it can control, which is the temperature, the wind factor, and the one thing that you'll love that I always talk about, the psychological profile of the team at that given time.
Absolutely.
So in other words, we've just played against a third division team in the cup and got beat 4-0 at home. Or we've played against Real Madrid away and we've beaten 3-0. Do you think the players are the same?
Absolutely. No, exactly. Precisely.
And then they come out with all this, pseudo-scientific nonsense. Well, they should be if they're motivated correctly. I said, well, you don't.
Incredible.
You've never worked with a human being. You're working under, it's what we call perfect training or perfect conditions. So everything that you've said is correct. Like the other thing they all come out with is, we should do, microcycles and macrocycles and all these things. I say, yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
I agree with all this about, adaptation and all this stuff. And I said, have you ever worked as a team? And I said, well, no. And I said, well, let me give you an example. The better the team, the more successful they are, the worse it becomes. And I said, well, how does that work? And I said, well, Porto, for example. In 5 years, I was at Porto 4 years, and we'd won the championship for 5 consecutive years. They got to the final of the Champions League, the UEFA Cup, etc., etc., etc. Now, what these people don't realise is that these guys aren't playing on a level playing field. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, okay, I'll give you an example. Benfica, who were the biggest rivals at that time, they played 38 games in the league, the same as Porto. Porto are in the Champions League. They got through the qualifying stages and they qualified the quarterfinals and etc., etc. Benfica didn't qualify. So that means Porto played 10 more games in that competition. Benfica got knocked out in the second round of the Portuguese Cup. Porto won it, so that's another 7 games. That's 5 more games. So Porto, at the same level of the season, have played 15 more games than Benfica. So how can you judge? Oh well, and I said, well, all these statistics that you're using are fantastic for, when they're talking about adaptation. And then you say, and the other thing about that success, because of Porto, they play Sunday, Tuesday. So all of the things that, in theory, that you do, which I totally agree with, you play every Sunday, you come in on Monday, you stretch, you do that, etc. I said, you can't do any of that simply because you play Sunday, you've got a game on Tuesday, say, for example, in Russia. So you have to travel the day before, because by UEFA rules or FIFA rules, if you're playing in those competitions, you have to train on the pitch that you're playing on the night before. Absolutely. So that means you've got all the travelling to get there with the time differences. Then you get there, sleeping in a different bed, which is another point of discussion because of the cruciality of sleep and recuperation. So they've got all of these things. Then they've got to motivate themselves again to play on Tuesday against good teams. And then they've got to fly back, and then they've got to rest, recover. So all the things about you just said, okay, we play Sunday, we'll have them in my month. You can't do any of that.
Absolutely. No, that's
so you're compromising all of the time, and that's the thing that these guys can't handle, because it's not written in straight lines, what we call fixed pattern thinking or fixed pattern training. It's variable and it's random, and that one word completely destroys them because they can't handle it.
Absolutely. No, you've got to adapt, and that's for sure. And I once had one of the sports scientists, one of the biggest clubs in the world, ask me about the cortisol levels being high after the Champions League games and some of the ways to...
That's a shock.
Precisely, and basically I said I can sort of propose some evidence-based methods from a psychological perspective that you can look at, but equally the other thing you can do is just say, take the day off and spend it with your family, and that'll help from the stress appraisal situation, and like you said, the motivation should carry the player through and just adapt. I think there's a place to sort of to obviously like yourself, the academic side is really important, but there's that human element too that you got to sort of that realization, and if it's not in the book for some of these coaches these days, it's like and not just these days, it's gone on for a long time. Precisely, yes. It's like you got to think outside the box, and I think for me some of the things you've touched on. So the time's getting the best of us. I could speak to you for another 2 or 3 hours if we had time to do so, but hopefully we'll get you back on the show again throughout the year. Roger's been great. It's been great to have you on the show, and I think for me, anyone listening to the show, particularly if you're sort of looking to get into football, you're in football, hang on to every last word that you've mentioned on the show. But is there any way anyone can get in touch with you in terms of, I know you do books and talks and all that sort of stuff. Roger, you care to sort of share any details of where?
Yeah, well, I'm available. I mean, I've got a big gymnasium and studio at my home.
Yeah.
I live in the middle of 800 acres of land, which belongs to the farm, not me. I live in a 500-year-old massive gravy house, and so I have coaches and players from all over the world come, and I still train them. Or I'm open to to lecture. I mean, at the moment I'm working for the New Zealand national team, so I'm based in Europe because we've got a lot of European-based players, and then when we have games, I travel across to wherever we're playing. But I am available the rest of the time, and if people want to get in contact with me, RogerSpry.com. Very simple. That's
fantastic, and I really want to thank you for coming on board the show, Roger. It's been a privilege, and thank you for listening to the Friday Sports Show on Salford City FM 94.4. Till next week, have a fantastic weekend, and great to have you back next week again. All the best.
Okay, my friend.